Well, it's good to be with you today, and I've got a question for you as we get kicked off and rolling this morning. Simple question. How do you respond? Like, seriously, how do you respond? Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, respond to what? You know, I mean, it depends. Like, what are you talking about? Okay, let me. I'm glad you asked. Let me give you a couple of things. How do you respond when you do something at work that really is exceptional, that it really is more than anybody would expect, and somebody else gets credit for it? How do you respond to that? How do you respond if you happen to be married and you feel like, I'm really pouring so much into this relationship, I'm really trying, I'm really investing myself in this relationship, but it seems like my spouse isn't. They're not even trying. How do you respond to that? How do you respond when it goes bad and it goes wrong and it's not your fault, but for some reason you end up being blamed? You're the one that's held accountable even though it really didn't have anything to do with you. How do you respond to that? See, every one of those situations is unfair. And we know it. We know in our heads, like you've heard this, and I'm sure you heard it as a kid. You probably heard it from your parents. You probably hear it from your coworkers, your friends, whatever. Life isn't fair. And you're like, yeah, I know. And so I want things to be fair, but I know that life isn't fair. So simple question. How do you respond when it's not fair? And we talked last week, there's times you just shrug it off. It wasn't that big a deal. Okay, no big deal. It's not going to change my life. I can keep going. But how do you respond when it is a big deal? How do you respond? There's a couple options. Like, there's some really good options. One option for responding to things that aren't fair is correction. You just try to correct the situation. Like, okay, maybe it was a mistake, maybe some misunderstanding, whatever. We just correct it, and maybe that'll get us back to fair. Another response, a little bit tougher, is forgiveness. Like, it was wrong. It shouldn't have happened. It didn't go down like that. I don't know why, but I'm going to try to choose to forgive the person, the situation, all the stuff. Even though it wasn't fair, I'm gonna try to forgive. Another option is justice. We're gonna figure out how to set this right, whatever that takes. And you know, those are all good options, good responses. And as you hear them, you might be thinking about your own situation, the unfairness you've experienced, and be thinking to yourself, yeah, but there's another response I like better. It's called revenge. Like, I like that one a lot better. I mean, you know, forgiveness, correction, justice, those are all nice ideas, but revenge is really good, you know, and I know you're not those people. I mean, that's other people, right, that want revenge, that like revenge. That's not you until it happens to you. It happens to your family. And then all of a sudden, it's like we start having these mental fantasies, right? Even if we can't do anything, we start having these mental fantasies about, oh, wouldn't it be so good if they walked in and they got caught, or if they, you know, if somebody found out, or if somebody accidentally made a call and let somebody know, you know, wouldn't that be so great? And we run through all these fantasies, even down to the level of just having a comeback, right? Somebody's insulting or somebody's difficult. It'd be so great. Oh, I should have said that. And we all channel our inner George Costanza. I apologize if you're not a Seinfeld fan. You want to land that jerk store line, you know, like, oh, it's a jerk store. You know, you want to land that line. And you feel so much better if you just get a little revenge. Funny story that I came across thinking about revenge, and I was talking about this guy's trucker. He pulled into a diner in a small town and walked in, he ordered, he got a hamburger and a cup of coffee and a piece of pie, and he started eating his lunch, and these motorcycle guys came in after, and about just maybe a few seconds after he got his food. And they decided they were going to have some fun with this guy, and so one guy picked up his hamburger and took a bite of it, another guy spit in his coffee, and the third guy just threw his pie on the floor, and just to see what he would do. Didn't do anything. Quietly got up, paid his bill, and left. And they all kind of laughed and congratulated themselves, and they were joking with the waitress, and like, not much of a man. She's looking out the window, and she goes, he's not much of a driver either. He just ran over 3 motorcycles with his semi, you know. And like, we like that, right? Yeah. Probably the best story of revenge of all time comes from a movie called The Help. It was set in the 1960s. And it was about rich white families in the deep South that had hired black African-American maids to come and work. And they were so often underpaid and mistreated and falsely accused and unjustly fired. And it just was not a fair situation at all. And if you've seen the movie, you know the story. But there's a lady named Minnie that is one of the maids that decides to get even. And she bakes a chocolate pie. And it looks like chocolate. Everything that would be in a chocolate pie is in this pie. There's one other thing in this pie, and it came out of Minnie, and it looks like chocolate, right? And she mixed it into the pie, and she serves it to this lady named Hilly. Hilly, who was one of the particularly bad, awful housewives. And Hilly ate that pie. And she liked it so much, she ate 2 slices. And she forever became known as 2-Slice Hilly. And if you saw the movie, you probably had the same experience I did. People are laughing, cheering, and disgusted all at the same time in the theater. Like, I can't believe it. She just ate pie with human waste in it, and it was just such a good gotcha moment, right? We love the revenge. But what do you do when you can't get revenge? When it's not fair, and it's frustrating, and you can't fix it. What do you do? Reminds me of a story that we've been looking at. We're looking at a conversation between a man named Habakkuk, who you may have never heard of, and God. And here's the thing about this. This conversation is so similar to conversations you have had with God. Even if you're not a church person, even if you haven't gone to church a lot or been engaged with that, or you're not even sure about God just yet and who he is and what he does and all that kind of stuff, you've probably had a conversation just like the one Habakkuk is having. Habakkuk lived in about 600 BC. And if you've got a Bible or the app and you want to follow along, we're going to be in Habakkuk chapter 2 in just a moment. But they've been having this conversation. And what Habakkuk did was he looked around and he said, look, the world around me stinks. People are being awful to each other. And I don't know this for a fact, but I kind of wonder if Habakkuk himself hadn't been a little bit of a victim, hadn't had a little bit of that unfairness kind of splash up in his life too. Because he's looking around, he's so discouraged and he's so dejected, and he's looking around, he's going, God, this isn't fair. This isn't the way the world should work. And in a very respectful way, he's asking God, what are you going to do about this? God, like, you're too good to let this go on. You need to do something, right? And God answers him. And God tells him, I am doing something. It's not what you expected. It's not going to happen the way you think it should, but I'm doing something. Which is initially encouraging, and then he hears what he's going to do. And this may not mean a lot to you, but to Habakkuk, it was horrific. It brought fear and panic and just unbelievable confusion to his life. Because God said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the Babylonians. And they're going to come, this other nation is going to come, they're going to invade your country. They're going to tear down your capital. They're going to kill a bunch of people. They're going to haul a bunch of people off, and they're going to leave everything destitute. And Habakkuk just, I can't get there. I can't make sense out of this. And to Habakkuk, it's almost like a preschooler had a meltdown and we sentenced him to prison for the rest of their life. It's such an overreaction. It's like, you can't go that far. This makes no sense. And Habakkuk kind of finishes up chapter 1, this part of the conversation by saying, God, can you help me? Can you explain this? Because this doesn't make sense. And I don't know if you've ever been in that spot, but I think most of us have. Where we look around and we feel like this isn't right, this isn't fair. And we don't like it when it's happening out there. We really don't like it when it's happening right here. And we want God to be God. We want him to be good. We want him to fix things. We want him to straighten it out. We want him to make it better. And then if he's not, we get confused. We start to flounder. We wonder, am I believing the wrong things? Did I do something wrong? Is God not really who he said he was? We start having all these questions, and that's where Habakkuk is. And he stops and he waits. And that's where we pick up this part of the conversation. In chapter 2, verse 1, he asked his questions. He expressed his concerns. And then he says this in chapter 2, verse 1. He says, this is Habakkuk talking, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he, talking about God, will say to me and what answer I'm to give to this complaint. In other words, God, you can't do this. What do you have to say for yourself? Chapter 2, verse 2. And the Lord replied, write down the revelation, make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and it will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. You read that and you think, well, that's kind of poetic. It sounds kind of interesting. In essence, what God is saying is this. He's saying, put it in all caps text, right? Put it on the headline. Announce it to everyone. I am getting ready to do something. I'm going to do it. I'm going to respond. He's trying to get Habakkuk's attention. And then, verse 4, he gives the answer. He says, how am I supposed to make sense of this? How is this supposed to work? This isn't fair. This isn't the life I expected. People around me, all the stuff, all the questions. Verse 4, see, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Some of you, your translations say the righteous will live by faith. You might feel like, that's not much of an answer. I really wanted something a little more nuts and bolts, a little more, I'm going to come in and smash everything and fix everything. I mean, I wanted like something more specific, and you're simply saying that the righteous will live by faith. But let's pull that apart for just a second. Who are the righteous? The righteous are people that are in a right relationship with God. I hope that's you. You and God are the only ones that can actually determine that. But he said the righteous, the people that are in a right relationship with God, will live by faith. What does it mean to live by faith? Especially when life isn't being fair. How do you live by faith when life isn't being fair? God's answer is pretty simple. He kind of gives him two options. He says, in essence, you can do one of two things. You can deal with the unfairness by living in faith, or you can do something else. And by the way, we'll see in just a minute, everything else is failure. When life is unfair, you live by faith or in failure. Those are the two options. I know we hate that. We hate only having two choices. This is God speaking, and God is telling this person who's struggling with the fairness of life, who's struggling with what he sees around him, he's saying, you got two options. You can live in faith or you can live in failure. Those are the two options that you have. And before we get to the failure, let's talk about faith for just a moment. The righteous, the people that are right with God. Hopefully you. What does it look like? How do you live by faith, live in faith, especially when your life isn't fair? I think at the big scale, like you think of it as a funnel. At the top of the funnel, it starts with the big ideas, right? It goes back to reminding yourself, wait a minute, I know my life isn't the way I wanted it to be. I know the things that have happened to me are hurtful and not fair. I also know that God is good, that God does love. And for many of you, you can look back and you can see, and in the past, I've seen God come through many, many times. So big picture, big end of the funnel, it starts by simply recognizing who God is and what God has done. If I'm going to live by faith, I'm going to live in faith, it starts with a recognition of who God is, what he's done around me, and what he's done in me. That starts the process of living by faith. But then the funnel gets a little more narrow. And it narrows down a little bit, and it narrows down to who's Jesus? And what has Jesus done for me? Living by faith, living in faith is going back to, sometimes you got to go back to the very basics of all basics, especially when your emotions are out of whack and your life seems to be running crazy. What do I know that I know that I know? That Jesus came, that Jesus died for my sins, Jesus rose from the dead, and it brought life to me. I can't explain all the stuff that's happening. My feelings are real. My hurts are there. My confusion is obvious, but I know these things are true. I'm living by faith. But then when you get to the bottom of the funnel, here's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. What does your life actually look like? And I'm going to throw out some possibilities. I'm not saying these are the only ways. But sometimes living by faith, you know what it looks like? It looks like choosing to worship God even when everything seems wrong. Even when everything seems unfair. Sometimes living by faith is simply choosing to connect with my community group. If you're part of our church, you know what I'm saying. It's the groups that we have where we get together, we do life together, and we connect with each other. And sometimes when life isn't fair and things aren't getting fixed and we don't want to wait anymore, we tend to pull back from relationships. We pull back from the people that can support us and help us and encourage us. And choosing to live by faith is just the opposite. No, I'm leaning in to the people that I know love me and love God, even though things aren't fair and I'm hurt and I'm confused. I'm going to lean in to the relationships, not out from the relationships. Sometimes it's as simple as choosing, I am going to read God's word and listen to what God has to say to me. I'm hurt, I'm upset, I'm confused. I still want to hear what God has to say. That's living by faith. And one I know applies to everybody. You get really right down to the bottom of the funnel of trusting God and living by faith. I'm going to love the people that God has put in my life. The ones that treat me well and the ones that treat me unfairly. It doesn't mean I have fond emotions and I'm excited to see them. It means I choose to love them. I want God's best for them. I am not going to hold against them what I could hold against them. I'm going to forgive, and I'm going to choose love. That's what it looks like to live by faith and live in faith in the middle of the unfairness. And I know what some of you are thinking, or at least I'll be honest with you, what I think sometimes. Well, then choosing to live by faith feels a lot like giving up. Doesn't it? Doesn't it feel like you're kind of giving up? Like, oh, well, things are bad. Oh, well, I'm a mess. I'll just kind of hope that God fixes it. I'm giving up. That's not what you're doing at all. We're going to see in just a minute. What you're doing is waiting. And waiting is not doing nothing. We get this idea in our heads sometimes that waiting on God is doing nothing. No, waiting on God is actually an incredible expression of your faith. It's not doing nothing. It's not giving up. It's putting your trust in someone that can do something about it and believing that he will. But just in case you aren't convinced, he goes on, and we don't have time to read all of them, but from verse 5 through verse 19, I hope you'll read this later today, chapter 2. It'll take you 5 minutes to read, but it may impact the moment you're in right now in an incredible way. He goes through all the other options and the ways that it fails when things are unfair and we don't live by faith. When we try to get back, when we try to create justice on our own, when we take things into our own hands, how it fails, how it turns back. And it's also a picture of what God has said he will do. Because if you noticed, he said, if it lingers, wait for it. If it feels like it hasn't caught up yet, if it feels like the justice that is owed is still slow in coming, if it feels like the situation could have been fixed by now and it's still not fixed, he says, though it lingers, wait for it. Wait for it. Waiting is not doing nothing. Waiting is counting on God to do what he said he would do. It's an expression of your faith. And so he goes through this list. He outlines some pretty incredible things. He says, for those who choose to take advantage of others, for those who choose to live their life in such a way that they don't mind taking advantage of people that can't defend themselves, who prey on other people. He said, preying on others will turn you into prey. If you're the person that says, I'm going to take advantage, I'm going to take the ability that I have, the strength that I have, and I'm going to use it over somebody that's weaker than me, I'm going to take advantage of them. He says, when you prey on others, what will happen is you will become prey eventually. Wait for it. Though it lingers, it will come. For those that decide, I am going to fix this with my money. I will make enough money. I will have enough money. I will get enough money. I will make money the goal and the purpose and the means by which I win at life. And he says, believing in your wealth costs you your soul. You can't take advantage of people and fix everything. You can't trust your money and fix everything. He says, believing in your wealth costs you your soul. The next example he gives, he talks to all of us that love to be in control, that love to, kind of control freaks, people that want to be in power. Some take it so far as to try to use even violence or intimidation. Most of us, we just try to manage our life in such small, minute detail that we can control everything. We control our kids, we can control our work, we control our schedule. We're going to control everything. And he tells you if that's the way you try to solve everything, pursuing power will eventually exhaust you. Which is ironic because you're going after getting control, and what's happening is it's emptying you as you try to get control. He says that doesn't work. And if that's the way you see people being unfair to you, wait for it. It lingers, but it will come. He talks about people that are willing to shame others. People that are willing to take advantage, not just because they're stronger or weaker, but that see other people as an end, as a means to an end. I'm willing to use you to do whatever I need to do that makes me happy. I'm willing to use you to make money. I'm willing to use you sexually. I'm willing to use you financially. Whatever way it needs to be, as long as I get what I want, I am willing to use you, and I have no shame in my appetites. And people that do that find out that shaming others brings you shame. Wait for it. If it lingers, it'll surely come. Finally, the last category he talks about are people that base either getting even or taking advantage on deception. I'm very comfortable lying. I'm very comfortable deceiving. As a matter of fact, I do it so well, I've deceived myself. And I work so hard, and you might think, well, that seems kind of odd. I'm so concerned with my image and how I present myself and how I help that people see me that I spend all of my time on that. And really what I'm doing is I'm trusting in me. I'm making a little God out of myself. what I want, what I need, the way I see the world, the way it should work. I'm trusting in those things that I can actually create a world around me that is something that will make me happy, keep me safe, make sure that everything is fair for me. And he says trusting in those kind of things is trusting in what will turn on you. So he goes through all this list of all these things, and he shows in each and every case that when you go about it this way, what ends up happening is it bites you back. That's why he says you can live by faith, or you can live in failure when life isn't fair. And what's fascinating about this to me is he is reminding Habakkuk and you and me all through this conversation, over and over and over, that I am good, that I am in control, and that I am not silently watching the world go by. It's not that I can't do anything. I have a plan. I have a timeline. It may not be your timeline, but I have one. I have a plan. It may not be your plan, but I have one. And I will set things right. For those that have experienced injustice, God will bring justice to them. For those that have caused suffering, God will require justice of them. And here's the thing, because it's easy to think, well, is this some kind of karma thing? No. This is not cosmic karma, but a righteous God who rights the wrongs. This is who God says he is. And when Habakkuk says, it's not fair, you haven't done anything, what you're doing doesn't seem good, God says, I am righteous, and I will right the wrongs. And I love how this conversation finishes, or at least this portion of the conversation. Verse 20. In verse 20, he says this. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. See, Habakkuk started off this conversation. He started off this portion of the conversation in silence. He asked God a question and he said, I'm going to wait and I'm going to listen. God, whatever you want to say, I want to hear it. And then God spoke. And in verse 20, it's almost as if God says, I have spoken. And Habakkuk says, you know what the response is when God speaks? Just soak it in. Just soak it in. I don't need to complain. I don't need to blame. I don't need to ask God to explain himself. I just want to soak in what he said. I started off asking a question, and God was so good and so gracious. He answered my question, and now I'm going to be silent again, and I'm going to soak in what God has said. That's the hard part. Much like we don't like waiting. We don't like being quiet. Because again, we equate being quiet as doing nothing. That if I'm quiet, then I'm just accepting everything. Then I'm just weak. Then I'm just letting people roll over me. No, not if you're soaking in what God has said. Waiting is an expression of your faith if you're believing and counting on God to respond. Being silent before him and soaking in what he said is an expression of your faith. If you've been asking God and God is responding and you are soaking it in, you're not doing nothing. You're doing exactly what you need to do. And I think it's such a great picture for you and I. Because while this happened, well over 1,000 years ago, a long time ago, it's a situation that's so common for us. And so what do you do? Because it's great for Habakkuk, right? It's great when you're reading ancient history. It's great when, you read about somebody else, somewhere else, and this happened and that happened, and over the course of 10 years or 20 years, it was finally set right, and you think, oh, that's so good. But when it's you, and when it's happening right now, it's much more difficult. It's good to hear the story because it's encouraging, but it doesn't do a lot to help you move through Monday. So let's talk about how you move through Monday when life isn't fair, but you're making the decision that I'm going to live by faith. I'm going to live out my faith. I don't want to choose the failure options. I want to choose the faith option. So how do I do it? How do I do it? The first thing, when you're wobbling, which that's what most of us are doing, when things aren't fair and we're not sure and we feel confused, when you're wobbling, wait on God. Wait on God. And again, I know, I said earlier, it feels like giving up. It feels like you're doing nothing. That's not true. You wait on God. Did you notice the dynamic between God and Habakkuk? There is a real conversation going on. This isn't a made-up thing. This is a real-life person in a real experience and relationship with God, and he wrote down what happened. It can be the same for you. And you might say, well, I got to be honest, I don't know if I've ever had a conversation with God before. Not like that, not like the one you're talking about, but you can have it. You absolutely can have it. You can go to God with your questions. You can go to God with your hurts. You can go to God with your demands. God, this isn't fair. This isn't right. This isn't just. It shouldn't be like this. God, how come you've allowed this? You can go to God with all of those things. And then you listen to God respond. And you might say, well, how do you hear that? The primary way is through his word. The primary way that God speaks to us is through his word. And the reason we tell you to read the Bible isn't so you can be a good person and know a lot of Bible facts. The reason we tell you to read the Bible is because God is speaking to you. And that's how this conversation so many times plays out. And one of the things I love, and I don't know about you, one of the things I love about God and about the conversations he's willing to have. You know how, especially if you're parents, you had a little kid, sometimes you feel like, or maybe you had a bad employee or whatever the situation is, you feel like, I've had this conversation so many times, I can't have this conversation anymore. We talk about the same thing every time, over and over and over, answer the same questions, we're back at the same place all the time. Do you know that God would be perfectly legitimate in his feelings if he felt that way about us? Like, we've gone over this so many times. How many times are we going to go over this? And you know what? He never does that. He's happy to have the conversation again. He's happy to speak to you again. You go back to his word over and over and over and over and over and ask your questions, and he is not offended. He is not put out. He is not mad. He is happy to have that conversation with you. So when you're wobbling, you wait. And one of the things that you do when you wait is you listen to what God has to say to you in the moment. Second thing that happens when it's not fair and you're trying to live by faith, I want you to insist on influence. Insist on influence. If we'd had a chance, verse 14 has an incredible expression. It says, the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the deep. In other words, God's glory is going to show up in this unfair situation in such an incredible way. It's going to be as obvious as water in the ocean, right? I mean, nobody's going to miss this. Bring that down to a micro level to your world and your moment, and the unfairness that you're experiencing. When you walk through it in faith, I guarantee you, God is going to use it to have an influence on other people. Well, how does that, what does that even look like? What does that mean? It's very simple. When the people around you see you going through this, and they know it's not fair, and they know it's not right, and they know you're hurting, and they start asking questions like, don't you want to get them back? Aren't you going to respond? Why don't you, how do you have the strength to? How can you keep moving through this? All of a sudden, you have an incredible opportunity to simply respond, it's my faith. It's Jesus that's carrying me through this. That's where the strength comes from. That's why I don't feel like I have to get revenge. That's how I can allow myself and see this situation where I'm being treated unfairly, but I'm not going to let it turn me into a bitter, hateful person. And it's not because of me, it's because of God and what he's doing in me. And that has influence on other people. That's where God takes something that's difficult and hard, and he uses it for good. And believe me, if you've got to go through this, if you've got to go through the unfairness, don't you want something to come out of it that's positive? One of the things that comes out of it is an influence. And finally, last thing, you're going to move through this on faith. You're going to deal with the unfairness this way. You can be assured by awe. Because one of the things we need when things aren't fair is we need to be assured. We need to be assured that God is with us, that God still loves us, that God sees, that God knows, that God's going to respond. We may not understand all the details, but we need to be assured that he is going to do that, and it happens by awe. Going back to that example that Habakkuk set, when God speaks, I'm just going to soak it in. It may not scratch all my itches right here in this moment. But I'm going to trust God that he knows enough, that he understands enough, that he's smart enough, that he's control enough, that he's got everything under control enough, that when he says something to me, I'm just going to soak it in. I'm going to trust it. And here's what happens. Back to that idea of something good coming out of this. When you let the unfairness, the hurt, the pain, the struggle, the confusion that you feel push you towards Jesus, that circumstance, that situation just became a tool that God's using to develop your relationship with him, to increase your faith in him, to develop a tighter, more dependent relationship on Jesus. Is it any fun? No. Do you want to sign up for it? No. Does God take it and do something good with it? Yes. He grows you, and he uses you as an influence on others when you walk through the unfairness in faith. So how do you respond? We want to fix it. Kicker is, in some of the most important, most meaningful, most difficult moments of unfairness, we can't. We can't fix it. You know exactly what I mean. It's not a give up. It's not a desperation. It's not being a skeptic. It's just simply saying, look, I can't fix that. It's not in my control. So what do? You choose faith. Because God can fix it. And God does fix it. And God has promised to set things right. You see, choosing faith fixes what isn't fair. Everybody's got unfair. But you can choose faith. That can be your response. And allow that to fix what isn't fair. That's who I want to be. That's who I want you to be. I want us to be the kind of people where we look at the unfair situations of life. We're not foolish. We're not naive. We're not going to just shrug our shoulders and pretend like everything's okay. But we are going to choose to live every moment in faith, the fair moments and the unfair moments, because we know that God is going to use that for good. And we also know that God, who has come through every single time, has promised that even if it's slow, even if it lingers, he's going to set things right. And in that, we have assurance. Our confidence is not in ourselves. It's in a God who is righteous and promises to set things right. And that's what happens when we live by faith. Let's pray together. Father, it's emotional. There's so many times we look at our life and it's not what we expected. People treat us in ways that it's not right. It shouldn't happen. It's hurtful. And God, sometimes it's really hard for us to move past those feelings. But I thank you so much for giving us an example of what it looks like to live in faith in the middle of unfairness. Because we all experience it, Father. We all need your help in the middle of it. And so, God, I pray that you would give us the courage today to come and sit quietly before you, to listen for the answers that you give, to soak in whatever you have to say. And Father, all of us are praying today. The things we experience, the hurt, the unfairness, the difficulty, God, we're praying that you would use them for good. Teach us to depend on you. Use it to have an influence and a witness on the people around us. We love them. We want them to know who you are and that you love them the same way. Father, none of us are signing up to go through hard things. But at the same time, we are so thankful to know that you walk through it with us. Father, continue to speak to us as we continue to worship you. In Jesus' name.